What an incredible day one we had yesterday, from the thought-provoking talk by Jeremy to the thrilling debates, panel discussions and presentations. And what better way, really, Roxanne, to close off the day than with the funny man himself, an icon and a legend hailing all the way from Kempton Park, Mr. Scout Beggar. It was equally a pleasure networking with all you in the room today. If we've not yet had a chance, I would love to meet you, get to know you during our numerous coffee breaks. My name is Encromilla Andrew, and I'm one of your program hosts today, joined by my lovely co-host, who you all voted into power, by the way, Roxanne Tobias. Roxanne, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks, Encromilla. Great to be back again today. Before we kick off today's event, let's once again say thank you to the people that have made today all possible. Thank you to our sponsors and exhibitors, SA3, Milliman, Liberty Group, Discovery, Sanlam, Hannovery, Genry, Insights Actuaries, MBE Consulting, Old Mutual, RGA, Hollard, QED, Data Symphony, Dynamo Analytics, FIS, Global, M&G Investments, Momentum Metropolitan, Munich Re, Network Finance, SCORE, Software Alliance, Swift-Re, Giovanni Actuaries and Consultants, Algorithm Consultants and Actuaries, and Outsurance. Remember, when you guys do visit the exhibition hall, please do visit the hydration station to fill your water bottles that you received, and then also please visit the mosaic wall and do add your selfie. We really need all of you to contribute to make a visual reminder of this historic convention. Again, Discovery is hosting a working lounge where you can charge up, have a short face-to-face, or answer some quiet emails. And then the Insights Chess competition continues at their stand today. And then if you're in need of a private meeting space, try one of the meeting pods. But again, note that these are on a first-come, first-served basis.
A few more important things to note: that you need to collect the garderobe on level 0 in the registration area. If you didn't already collect them yesterday, for those who are not able to find socks, please note they are now available, so please do so today. If you've purchased the ticket to attend the cocktails and dinner tonight, you will need a wristband for access, so please make sure you collect that as well at the garderobe. Parking tickets will have to be collected each and every single day, so you will need a new one today. So now let's talk about the grand chess finale. The finals, the moment we've all been waiting for, will be taking place during this morning's refreshment break session. This is where we'll witness the crowning moment of the very first ever Insight ASA Convention Chess Champion. And I know what you're all thinking about. It's just the title. No, it's just not the title, not just the bragging rights, but there's also a 10,000 Rand cash prize that awaits the victor or victrix. And of course, the matching donation to the Moves for Life organization. A big thank you for that. So be sure to catch the final at the 9 a.m. refreshment break in the chess tournament area of the exhibition hall.
And then a quick reminder about Q&As. As you witnessed yesterday, we'll do Q&As directly after each presentation. Preference will be given to the in-person questions, and a staff member will walk around with a mic to take your question. Our virtual attendees can post their questions on the app, and we will pose them to the speakers if there's sufficient time. If your question doesn't get asked, again, a reminder that you can please feel free to reach out to the speakers via the connection function on the app.
Thank you. So we now get things started off and look into gaining a good understanding of weather factors that influence short-term insurance claims and how these can be analyzed in actuarial framework. Ladies and gentlemen, this next session is titled Claims Modeling with Climate Data. And please help me welcome to the stage with your boldest applause our presenters, RONALD, RICHMAN, RENDANI MBUVHA, KOVLIN PERUMAL, Adam BALUSIK, and Caesar BALONA. Welcome, gentlemen.
Okay, so thanks for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending this talk. I'm going to be giving the first two sections and a quick introduction to the micro modeling component, and then I'm going to hand over to KOVLIN for the rest. Only two of us are up here on stage, but this is a significantly bigger project than I suppose two people could do. So we're very grateful to our co-authors who are not presenting with us for helping us out in this project. So just a quick run through of what we'll be discussing. I'm going to give a little bit of background why we think introducing climate data into claims modeling in the insurance industry is important, particularly when we think about the South African context and what we've been through in the last couple of years. I'm going to discuss at a high level some different approaches to physical risk modeling and give an introduction to micro modeling. KOVLIN's then going to talk through the main body of the presentation, which is on micro modeling, how you can join claims data sets together with climate data sets and really improve the quality of predictions from actuarial models in the process. And then we'll have a quick conclusion. So in terms of a little bit of background, for those of you involved in the short-term industry or reading just industry publications, you'll have seen that the industry is really suffering from a significant increase in catastrophe events. So this is from the United States over a 40-year period from the 1980s all the way up to up to 2020. And this is showing the cost per year as well as the number of large events in the United States. This is public information, and what you can see is that both the frequency and cost of events affecting the short-term insurance industry has been increasing quite dramatically. So what are the drivers? If you read industry publications, one reason is climate change. There's definitely an impact on the physical environment that we live in due to climate change. Other reasons are people are building in increasingly riskier areas like floodplains or in coastal areas that are at risk of flooding. And inflation is also driving some of these costs. But taken together, this represents a significant challenge to the financial stability and viability of the insurance industry. What you're finding in America is that in particularly catastrophe-prone states like California and Florida, insurers are pulling out, and you can't actually buy home insurance in those states as easily as you once could. So this is a huge challenge, and I think in a South African context, we're seeing something quite similar. So this is from an Old Mutual Insure pricing data set, and this is the frequency of small, medium, and large weather-related catastrophes. So you can see in the most recent period, we've just had this dramatic increase of large events as well as small and medium events. The exact definitions, I think a large we've defined as something over 50 million rand, and this is inflation adjusted. So again, you can see that in the South African context, at least from the perspective of Old Mutual Insure's data, we're having a very similar thing as what's happening in global markets. I'd say what's quite interesting when you talk to regulators, when you talk to rating agencies, a question that you keep getting asked is, are you still going to offer insurance in KZN after what's been happening there? So the same sort of dynamic about how this is affecting the insurance market is also starting to at least play out in people's thoughts. And I think we're a couple of catastrophe events away from insurers declaring certain parts of South Africa uninsurable. This is the impact in terms of severity. So you can see on the left-hand part of the slide, we've got our average annual CAT claims from 2000 to 2011. And on the right-hand part of the slide in blue, we've got that same average annual CAT claim from 2012 to 2022. You can just see the dramatic change in the average cost per claim on an annual basis. It's punctuated by some extremely large events like the KZN floods, like the Knysna fires, but the basic story is that catastrophe is really affecting both the specific company that we got this data from, but I think also more generally the wider South African short-term insurance industry. So what does this mean? What this means is that when you try buy reinsurance, so for those of you who've been through a reinsurance renewal recently, the reinsurers are not particularly delighted with South Africa. They've had several large events that they are still trying to recoup costs from. So there were the Sasria claims of about 30 billion rand, the KZN floods, that was an early estimate of 17 billion rand. I think that went up quite dramatically, becoming, as far as I know, the largest insured event in South African history, and that's on the back of COVID-19 claims. So just in terms of background, catastrophes, particularly large events, are affecting the South African industry quite dramatically, and that's the context in which we became interested in working out what sort of modeling can you do to better quantify this, better price for some of these risks, and understand the risks embedded in short-term insurance as a start. Okay, our screens are flickering a little bit. I hope it's not happening up there. So what we're going to go on to discuss is physical risk modeling. So whenever you start delving into the climate change space, you find that there's a big distinction between two types of risk categories. On the one hand, you've got physical risk. Physical risk is very similar to what short-term insurers have generally thought of as catastrophes and have dealt with through catastrophe modeling. And on the other side, you've got a whole group of risks called transition risk, which is what are the risks that companies are exposed to as the world around us changes and markets react. So if we dive into physical risk modeling, physical risks are tangible effects that climate has on a particular organization. So flooding, wildfire, rising sea levels. And I think a lot of these risks have always been dealt with through catastrophe modeling, whether in the SAM standard formula, where you've got hail and earthquake risk, or some other undefined catastrophe risks as well, or through the process of catastrophe modeling within insurers, where you run macro simulation models and try to work out what is the impact of these events on an insurer. What are some of the challenges when it comes to doing physical risk modeling? Data is a real problem. In the South African industry, we still do not have a good standardized way of getting data on large commercial policies, which often carry the most significant amount of risk to an insurer. But also data in terms of what's happening out there in terms of climate. It's quite difficult to get that information in developing markets, with South Africa not being any different than other developing markets from that perspective. Another very interesting one is physical risk from a climate change perspective is generally only expected to manifest over very long time horizons, say after 10 or 15 years from the current point in time. But if you think about the way that short-term insurers are regulated and how our risk management processes work, our current time horizon is very much built around a one-year period. So how do you reconcile that very short-term view that we take in SAM, in our accounting, with this much longer long-term horizon that is necessary to deal with the effects of climate change on things like catastrophe risk. Also, it's very interesting to think about nonlinear impacts and second-order effects. So a lot of climate models give you a good prediction 15 years out of what you expect your best estimate temperatures to be, but it's very difficult to work out what would the change in volatility be. And at least my personal belief is that a lot of the volatility we've seen in terms of catastrophe events recently is due to climate change, but not from a best estimate view, from a volatility perspective. And I guess a final point to make is also around regional variability. It's not like everything is happening in a homogeneous way across South Africa. There's quite a lot of differences depending on which region you're looking at. So this is a view that I'm quite fond of, and I've presented in a few places, on how we conceptualize how to model physical risk. On the one hand, you've got macro physical risk modeling, and on the other hand, you've got micro physical risk modeling. I'm going to mainly focus on the macro view, and then when I hand over to KOVLIN, we'll talk about the micro view. So what are these two different paradigms of physical risk modeling? So the macro view is that lots of insurers have got portfolio level models that start to try to quantify what is the impact or the potential impacts of a catastrophe on your portfolio. So lots of insurers will be running models through SAM for earthquake and hail risks. Some insurers also have got wildfire, flood, and windstorm models. And what's interesting is that these models generally are calibrated to the experience in the recent past, which means that they're not really forward-looking in the sense that they don't take climate change effects into account. if you read the industry literature, a lot of reinsurers and insurance-linked security investors are starting to lose trust in the outputs of catastrophe models for exactly that reason, because it's not forward-looking and they haven't been adjusted to take account of climate change. So in the macro view, the question that we're really trying to answer and the methodologies we're interested in is, how do you adjust these models to take the impact of climate change into account? And I'll delve a little bit into a methodology on how that's possible. And then the micro paradigm of physical risk modeling is, if you look at a classical process within actuarial work and within insurers, the pricing process links very granular individual claims data to your claims experience. And what we realized through this collaboration with all of the co-authors we mentioned earlier is you can also get climate data which looks at climate experience at a very granular level. And the approach that we try to take in the micro modeling perspective is, can you link all of this climate data into your traditional pricing process to quantify the effect of climate change? And those are exactly the results that KOVLIN's going to present. So just a quick view of what do we mean from a macro perspective. This is how we define climate change value at risk at OMI. If, let's say, just a straw man that your catastrophe models at a specified level of confidence, say your value at risk is 1,000 Rand a year, right? What you then can do is you can augment those models and say, what would that 1,000 Rand change to in various different climate scenarios? So you can consider different warming scenarios. That's the vertical axis of this table. The horizontal axis is that you can consider this over different periods of time. And what you can see is that in this toy example, we said our risk will increase the most in a warming scenario at a 5-year time horizon. Maybe an audience challenge is to back solve what the increase factor is if you are getting bored of hearing me talk. But the main point is that if you subtract this table from your baseline risk, this produces what we call a climate value at risk. It's the extra impact on your catastrophe risk arising out of climate change, and this is one way of quantifying your macro climate risk. This is just on the left-hand part of the slide, we've got a picture from the IPCC report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. They've done a huge amount of work. I think they've got over 2,000 or 3,000 climate scientists working on this, and it shows you what's your expectation around precipitation in South Africa going forward. And you can see the western part of the country is actually forecast to become drier. On the right-hand part of the slide, this is for wildfire. And you'll see that we've omitted the vertical axis on this slide, as we have done for all of the graphs in this presentation to preserve confidential information. But what you can really see is that you can quantify your value at risk from wildfire at various different return periods. We're starting at a 1 in 5 going all the way up to a 1 in 250, and in various different warming scenarios. And you can see for this particular risk, we expect quite a significant impact in terms of the value at risk. With that, we've discussed macro modeling. Let me introduce micro modeling, and then I'll hand over to KOVLIN. So the point of this micro modeling project that we're presenting to you today is really to answer this question: how do we link climate data to the traditional pricing process in a short-term insurer to quantify climate risks in a more granular manner? So what we're going to try to do and show to you today is, how can you incorporate very granular precipitation data into short-term pricing data sets? How can you fit machine or statistical learning models to those data sets to understand the predictive value added by these data sets? And then really try to understand what is the impact on insurance risk. And there's a very interesting result relating to SAM that we're going to present at the end of this talk, showing exactly how much risk you have just from your background climate risk. Just to say thank you to our co-authors. We've got a lot of people helping us from WITS, from UP, from ETH Zurich, and from the OMI catastrophe team. And we hope to publish a paper on this once the convention is done. So with that, let me hand over to KOVLIN to take you through the micro view.
Cool. Thanks so much, Ron. So I just wanted to open by saying that this is my first time presenting in front of the ASA convention. So I was really relieved to see that ASA had assigned us the smallest, most intimate venue for this presentation possible. Really appreciate that. And then also, if any of you have seen me present before at OMI, so I usually like to introduce a few dry jokes at the start of my presentation. Unfortunately, today's presentation is focused on precipitation and rainfall, so there will be no dry jokes. Cool. So as Ron mentioned, the main objective of our project is to see if we can link climate-related data to our traditional pricing data sets that are used in a short-term context. To achieve this end goal, we had to go through a variety of steps, each with their own complications and considerations. And for the rest of today's presentation, I'll go through each of these steps, namely geolocation, why that's important, selecting the actual climate-related data sets that we used, and in this case it was the CHIRPS precipitation data set, joining on precipitation to our exposure data set, fitting a few models to quantify the predictive value of this addition, and then analyzing model results on both an actual and forecasted basis from a variety of different angles that I'll go into more detail on a little bit later. So firstly, just a quick note on data considerations. So anytime that you start to do this type of modeling work, the data quickly becomes quite computationally intensive. So just for a quick example, our geolocated line of business pricing file had around 13 million rows and many columns in it. And the CHIRPS precipitation data set had around 19.5 million rows and a few columns. So memory management and optimization becomes very important. I think it's really important to try and have an actuarial as well as a sort of hybrid data scientist hat on when working with projects of this magnitude. And the selection of your tech stack is also quite important. We use Python and Pandas in particular for this. And I've just added in a few good practice principles to strongly consider to try and preserve your sanity and also avoid melting your laptop. So batch processing, memory efficient data storage, minimum viable data types, using vectorized operations where possible, and utilizing a GPU for modeling are all really good ideas to consider. Cool, so moving on to like the first real step of this exercise, we needed to geolocate our exposure data set. So why do we need to geolocate? That's the first step in any sort of modeling like this, where we need to append climate-related data sets, which usually have a geographical component, onto an exposure data set. So our geolocation was done through a third-party service provider, but there are definitely open source algorithms available for geolocation, such as Nominatum in Python. I think Clive Hogarth actually presented on this in 2018 in front of the ASA convention. Speaking from experience, one thing that you have to pay close attention to when using these open source geolocation algorithms are the fair use policies. You can get yourself IP banned if you use it egregiously, and that's a very awkward conversation to have with IT. Cool. So I've just shown a quick sample visualization of our geolocation efforts. This is just a small subset of our data. So there are a few things that we wanted to check on this view for reasonability. Firstly, there's a nice spread of risks across South Africa. Secondly, we have nice exposure clusters in the places that we expect them to be, so Gauteng, KZN, and the Western Cape. And lastly, we have no unexpected marine risks in this portfolio in the Atlantic or Indian Oceans, which is always nice when you're geolocating. So just to show the granularity of our geolocation efforts, if you zoom in to this view, you can see that we actually managed to geolocate our risks at a street level, and that is really cool and offers some really accurate potential for modeling. So once we geolocated our risks, we had to select a climate-related data set. The data set that we worked with is a precipitation data set called CHIRPS. It's curated by the Climate Hazard Center by UC Santa Barbara. And CHIRPS stands for Climate Hazard Group Infrared Precipitation with Station Data. It's a 35-year plus quasi-global rainfall data set, which just means it spans from 50 degrees south to 50 degrees north and across all longitudes. and ranges from 1981 to near present. So it incorporates in-house climatology, 0.05 degree resolution satellite imagery, and in-place station data to create a gridded rainfall time series that can be used for trend analysis and seasonal drought modeling. The structure of the data set itself is quite simple. There's only 4 columns. It has the date at which a rainfall measurement took place, the longitude and latitudes of that measurement, and then the actual rainfall measurement in millimeters. On the right, you can see a quick snapshot of what the data set looks like for the African continent at a certain point in time. So for an overall look at the trends that we see in that CHIRPS data set at both the South African and provincial level, we can see that over time there's been this sort of dip and then increasing trend in precipitation. Notably from 2020 onwards, there was quite a pronounced increase in precipitation, which is consistent with the La Nina meteorological phenomenon. Looking at per province, this is obviously a little bit more volatile, but you can see a similar trend. So, as I mentioned before, we managed to geolocate our data at quite a granular level, but with more granularity comes more problems. And the next question was posed as to how exactly we join these geolocated data sets to an appropriate precipitation measurement. So I've created this nice custom graph that shows the issue. We have these sporadic geolocated risks all over the place, but these very irregular intervals of precipitation measurements, and how exactly do you tie those two together? So it could be as easy as just selecting the nearest measurement, but that comes with its own issues, like you put yourself at risk of volatility of a certain measurement and tying a bunch of geolocated risk to it, but also that would involve iteration in Python, and anyone who's used Python knows that you have to avoid iteration at all costs. So we complicated it a little bit. We established a grid across the entirety of South Africa at a 0.05 longitude by 0.05 latitude degree of granularity. For each cell in the grid, it was uniquely defined by 4 coordinate points, and each of those coordinate points had an appropriate precipitation measurement. We created a grid precipitation value by just taking the simple average of these 4 measurements, and then we assigned our geolocated risks to each cell in the grid with the criteria that its latitude and longitude needs to be within the grid cell bounds. Cool. There are definitely more robust ways to probably calculate a grid precipitation per risk other than the simple average, but so an example of that would be to actually calculate the distance between each measurement and do a weighted average calculation. I looked at how long that would take to do, and then I put it immediately into model refinements. So once we joined our precipitation and loss experience data, we were able to create some cool views like this. This took much longer than I'd like to admit to create, but hopefully you can see that on the left-hand side heat map, the deeper blue that you get in precipitation over time usually corresponds with a deeper red in loss ratio experience over time on the right-hand side. The exact same trend can be shown more clearly in an Excel simple line graph. This we thought was a really incredible result. You can see clearly here for precipitation plotted against loss ratio that the peaks in precipitation more often than not correspond to a peak in loss ratio experience, and the troughs in precipitation follow a similar effect. Cool, but of course we can't rely on one-way analyses to infer causality. Firstly, because the ASA presentation would be way too short, but secondly, because there are confounding variables that could come into play, as well as correlations with already existing factors that are used in our pricing modeling. So we did have to do a couple of modeling steps. So I just wanted to introduce the modeling frameworks that we used. Hopefully, a lot of us in this room have become more and more familiar with this. But we utilized gradient boosted machines and neural nets for 2 modeling steps in our project. To quickly introduce gradient boosted machines and neural nets, Gradient boosting is a machine learning technique used mainly in regression and classification tasks. It produces a prediction model in the form of an ensemble of weak prediction models, which are typically decision trees. Each model trained in the ensemble is fit using residuals produced by previous models and a different subset of the underlying data to ensure that an overall improvement in a chosen loss metric is obtained until no further improvement can be made. The exact reason why we use GBMs and what we use them for and how we parameterize them I'll cover in a later slide. We also use a neural net. So this is a series of algorithms that endeavors to recognize underlying relationships in a set of data through a process that mimics the human brain. Neural nets generally consist of an input layer, hidden layers, and an output layer with optional embedding layers, and this is usually referred to as the neural network architecture. Complicated representations are learned in the hidden layers, with subsequent layers usually representing regressions on the variables, on representations of the variables learned in hidden layers. Cool. So for GBM implementation, we use GBMs to predict loss experience given precipitation experience, and we did this in a way that we tried to mimic a traditional short-term pricing exercise. So we had two main GBMs that we looked at, namely a frequency and severity GBM, and we altered the loss function and validation scores to coincide with the similar GLMs that would be used in a traditional pricing context. So Poisson mean deviance for frequency and a gamma mean deviance for severity. We used light GBM, the light GBM algorithm for both of these implementations. We also used a train test split that was time-based. So a train test split, just to introduce quickly, is how you separate your validation or unseen or out-of-sample data from your training data. We tested a variety of different methods. Time-based was found to be the most robust because there is a risk of time-based leakage when working with time series data. We also tested a hierarchical train test split on policy number, which keeps policies completely distinct between the train and test splits, but we found that that didn't pose much risk of leakage. So importantly, the inputs that we used in both GBMs were traditional rating factors that are used in actually pricing, the line of business we were looking at, as well as the inclusion and exclusion of our calculated grid precipitation factor. We used exposure as a weight, and then the outputs were frequency and severity for each of our GBMs. So for the neural net component, we used a neural net to forecast precipitation. We used the Keras algorithm in Python, and we used mean squared error as our loss function and validation score. So the inputs to our neural net were our grid cell bounds for the grid that was calculated, an overall precipitation prediction that is actually supplied by the OMI climate and catastrophe modeling team. Shout out to Caesar BALONA. And then finally the calendar month to try and take into account some elements of seasonality. And the output as required was a per grid cell level precipitation forecast that could be used in our models, in the previous model. So I've also included just a quick diagram of the neural network architecture. So there are three inputs, or there's an input layer that consists of three inputs that we talked about a little bit earlier. We use an embedding, particularly for our grid cell bounds, and embeddings are useful for reducing the dimensionality associated with really high dimensional categorical variables, and it allows the neural network to better handle these and hopefully produces a more robust result. We used a few dense hidden layers, which, as explained previously, just learns complicated representations of the inputs, and we used quite a few dropout layers as well, which is used to switch off parts of the neural network, the neurons in the neural network in each layer, to help prevent overfitting. It ensures that the neurons that are left on in each iteration can stand on their own 2 feet, basically. And then finally, the last hidden layer just corresponds to our per cell precipitation forecast. Cool, so finally, just to go into modeling results, we considered a few metrics. Firstly, Poisson or gamma mean deviance for as model goodness of fit tests that are to be minimized. We then looked at the feature importance to get a measure of value added to a model by inclusion of our precipitation feature. So there's two main ways that you can calculate feature importance using light GBM. So split and gain. Split is a measure of how many times the actual feature is used when making decisions in the underlying decision trees, and gain is a measure of how many classifications that have been made following those decisions. So we've just included split for the purposes of this presentation, but I tested both and they both have very similar results. Then to get a measure of the feature impact, we considered two sort of sensitivity plots. Firstly, policyholder sensitivity. This is equivalent to an independent conditional expectation plot that's been explained before by Ron. But in a pricing context, I just selected the base risk profile, the same way that you would in a traditional pricing exercise, to correspond to the risk factors with the highest exposure, and then varied precipitation to see how that impacts your predicted results. For partial dependence, it's also a sensitivity plot, which shows how your forecasts or your predictions are changed when holding the entire data set constant aside from the feature in question. Cool. So to look at the out-of-sample validation scores, we see a really cool result here that the frequency GBM and the severity GBM without precipitation perform the worst from a Poisson and gamma deviance perspective. With actual precipitation, the models performed or fit the best on both the frequency and severity implementation, and with the forecasted precipitation, it sits nicely in the middle, with still an adequate improvement on using just the traditional rating factors. So looking at the actual feature importance, we thought this was quite an incredible result as well. On the left-hand side, you can see all of the traditional rating factors that we use that have obviously been obfuscated. And on the right-hand side, you can see the same plot with the addition of grid precipitation, and you can see that grid precipitation actually ends up ranking the highest out of all rating factors considered from a feature importance perspective. This is with actual precipitation data. With forecasted precipitation data, the result is very similar for the frequency GBM implementation. Looking at the sensitivity of model predictions to varying grid precipitation, you can see that as expected on both a single base risk profile and on the entire book in terms of the partial dependency plot, as precipitation increases, so too does your predicted frequency or expected number of claims. For severity and a severity context, looking at the feature importance plots, again, we see a very similar result, which is quite surprising. Grid precipitation comes out as the top ranked feature compared to all traditional features that are included in our pricing model for severity. And on a forecasted basis, again, we see a very similar result. When looking at sensitivity, it's much more volatile on a severity basis, and we should probably implement one of Ron's smoothness and monotonicity constraints onto this. But you can see at an overall level, again, as precipitation increases, you have a higher expected average cost per claim. Cool, so combining everything together, we managed to get this sort of distribution of loss experience given differing years of yearly precipitation experience plot. So this was holding 2021 as a base, varying your actual precipitation profiles to correspond with different years of experience in precipitation in a geographically consistent manner, and then predicting what your loss experience would look like. So you can see here that this is done on using both actual precipitation and forecasted precipitation. And you can see that it varies quite a lot depending on the impact of precipitation. For recent years, we can see that spike in precipitation on both an actual and forecasted basis, and the relevant spike in our predicted number of claims. The good news is that for 2023, we are predicting that overall precipitation will come down slightly, and so will experience. Moving on to average cost per claim, we see a very similar trend. There is a slight gap in when you predict severity using actual versus forecasted, and that's as a consequence of our forecast model not being able to pick out like the extreme spikes in precipitation, but that will hopefully get better with more refinement. Again, we see that in 2023, the impact of reduced precipitation makes us expect a lower average cost per claim. And finally, at an overall loss experience view, we see again the variation. So we calculated the coefficient of variation that precipitation induced on this view, and we actually found that the precipitation-induced volatility on loss experience was calculated to equal 61% of the associated SAM measure of volatility for this line of business. And that is just one climate-related factor. So we thought that was quite a crazy result. Cool. So to conclude quickly, we have shown that traditional short-term pricing data sets can be linked to open source, highly granular precipitation data. We've demonstrated that precipitation data is a highly predictive factor when modeling insurance risk. We've demonstrated the relationship between changes in actual precipitation, frequency, and severity. We've obtained precipitation forecasts that can be used for practical implementations. We've demonstrated that these precipitation forecasts provide similar predictive value. And finally, we've obtained a distribution of loss experience, given differing years of precipitation experience for that proactive risk management. So finally, just to cover some lessons learned overall after this exercise, we've seen that new micro-level meteorological data sets can definitely enhance the accuracy of actuarial predictive modeling. And this begs the question, what other projects should we be thinking of? Be it other weather-related data sets and the impact on frequency and severity, or data sets such as air pollution and its impact on mortality. And we've also seen the value of partnering with academic institutions who can provide novel expertise. So I've just included our contact details should there be any in-depth questions, and if you want to reach out to get notified when the final working paper is completed. And I think that's it from our side. I'll just make sure that Ron has an active mic to answer any questions, and thank you so much.
Are there any questions from the floor? Can we get a mic over there? In the middle.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was super interesting. So I've got a few questions, but I've been told that it's better to go maybe one at a time. So my first question is, have you considered differing levels of granularity in the gridded precipitation data? The reason being that more granular doesn't mean more accurate, and considering that SHRPs would have to use their own model methodology to get to that level of granularity, you could be observing noise within their model process rather than necessarily an inaccurate fit on your side.
Can we get, is on? I think when you've got 30 years of data and there's some sort of regularity and regular process driving that, the lowest level of granularity works. And from a validation perspective, the fact that out of sample you get an improvement, I mean, you might be able to get a better improvement, but I think the results KOVLIN showed is that the level of granularity is fine. It's not noise.
Okay, I suppose off the back of that, did you consider grouping homogeneous points? So climate in certain regions might be similar enough to be able to group those. And the added benefit would be that things like flood events are based around cumulative rainfall and potentially rainfall in a grid point further away. Did you make that type of consideration as well?
So we are considering that. That might be a follow-up thing that we're going to do. So what we wanted to do is look at almost a sort of slightly aggregated point forecast, like KOVLIN showed, the aggregation over 4 grid points. I think there are other very interesting methodologies you can apply, maybe graph neural networks or transformers, which could aggregate experience over space and time. And that's definitely something that we think will add a little bit of value. but we didn't get around to doing that yet.
No, definitely. Just to add to that, I think this is just, the foundational step, and it just opens up, endless possibilities. And I think so for what you considered, I think it'll be quite interesting to model, but we'd probably have to use a neural net to tackle that, but it's something we are definitely considering.
And last question, promise. So given the number of steps required to get to some form of output, what advice on potential pitfalls do you have for people resorting to external models to perform a similar exercise from a validation perspective? So what are the key...
Just don't try this.
Cool.
I think in all seriousness, it definitely stretched some of our data handling skills. It is quite an intensive process. I really struggle to see how this could be done externally just by dropping in a model. And I think that's why, for example, when we responded to the PA's climate risk metrics recently, our advice is rather take the macro modeling approach unless you really need very specific policy level data. So if you're looking to derive something like a climate risk VAR at an aggregate level, this is probably overkill. If you're looking for something more granular that's, I suppose, more useful for quantitative risk management than just knowing what your VAR is, then I'd recommend going down this road.
Cool. And just from my perspective, I think it is incredibly worthwhile to understand those climate-related factors and how we can incorporate them, and definitely from a very micro view, catering to your specific organization. I think there is definitely value in this, whereas some of those external data sets and the way that they incorporate the climate data to get these overall benchmarks might not be as specific to your risk group. But yeah, I think it was super worthwhile, but yeah, definitely a lot of effort involved.
Hello. Thanks for your excellent presentation. Maybe a question to follow up from the previous gentleman's question. Besides just allowing for this risk in a pricing method, did you guys perhaps have a chance to look into like specific risk management interventions? Like which ones would be most optimal to manage this risk instead of just loading the pricing?
I mean, I think it's interesting if you're looking again at an aggregate level, the fact that 60% of your SAM capital for this particular line of business is explained just by precipitation variability. I think that probably tells you that SAM is undercalibrated, and with climate change impacts, what insurers probably need to think about is holding more capital, not less. So that's at a very aggregate level. At a micro level, there's definitely things you can do, but I'm not going to go into the details of that here.
Okay, thanks.
Hi there. Thanks very much for that presentation. It was very interesting. A couple of questions. Let me start with the micro one. I just want to understand the forecasting of precipitation. It looks like you guys got it very accurate. Is that 12 months into the future, so you can use it to rate kind of 1 year ahead? Maybe just more detail on that.
Yeah, we have an aggregate forecasting model. I'm actually thinking of throwing the mic to Caesar to ask him to explain that, but it's basically trained on an out-of-sample. It's basically trained using data up to a particular point in time, as well as a couple of other inputs from climate data sets, and then predicting 12 months ahead and making rolling forecasts. And then I think the point of the neural network that KOVLIN was showing is it's possible to at least create a best estimate way of distributing that aggregate forecast down to a very granular area. Yeah, I think including forecasted measures in your pricing is probably not a good idea. To be honest, I think it would induce too much volatility, particularly in such a volatile environment already, where rates should be changing quite rapidly. And I think that's just a global phenomenon on rate. It's not something specific to a company or to South Africa. So I don't think including forecasts is the way to go. I think this is much more useful from a risk management perspective than something you're going to try explain to your biggest intermediary what's going on in the pricing.
Cool, yeah, that's very interesting. Then more on the macro level, so looking at, for example, the KZN floods. I'm wondering if there's other ways to mitigate these types of risks. I know for the KZN floods, the state of the infrastructure had quite a big impact on the severity. So perhaps a 1 billion investment can save 10 billion in claims. I don't know if any research has been done on that or if you guys are looking at that at all.
My personal view on that is there's a limit to what the private sector can do. And I think the private sector doing infrastructure development like that might make sense at a risk level, like enhancing flood defenses, or if you've got your own home, maybe building French drains where it makes sense. But I think starting to deal with the aggregate infrastructure problems in South Africa is probably not the private sector's job. And to really mitigate those risks, you need active interventions from the government.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Balance things out whilst we give the mic to the next lady there. Okay. JF online is saying, is there some other weather-related measures that could be added in addition to precipitation to improve the claims severity modeling? For example, some measure of hail that might explain some high severities at relatively lower precipitation.
Should I take that? Yeah, I think there are a wide variety of these meteorological data sets available. One of the big challenges is getting it at a South African context or at a South African level and at the level of granularity that you want it. But definitely, I think going out there and looking at some of the open source ones and then considering some of the ones that are a bit more premium to use, you can see how important, and just from incorporating precipitation, we expect at least that there will be similar impacts on different meteorological data sets for sure. So yeah, applications like wildfire modeling is what one of the things we're looking at the moment, and hail is definitely something to consider.
Maybe just one comment to add on. Hail data is extremely difficult to get hold of, particularly because it's generally so localized in terms of its effects. So while adding hail is definitely something I think we'd like to do, it's a lot more difficult. So some of the CAT modeling vendors have come up with very innovative solutions where they're taking specific measurements in the upper atmosphere as a proxy for hail. But yeah, I think from the sort of micro application, that's maybe a step too far.
Cool. And then I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. That was really, really interesting. I'm very interested by the idea of extending this methodology to look at the link between air pollution and mortality. But have you considered how you would adjust it for the fact that properties tend to have a fixed geolocation, but humans are extremely mobile?
That's a great question, KOVLIN. I don't know. I think at the end of the day, as long as a person's not traveling too much, you're going to be spending probably upwards of 30 or 40% of your time in a pretty stable location. And at least that'll give you a good proxy. I mean, you have a very similar question when you do motor pricing. Which postal code do you use? Do you use home address, work address, both, a combination of other things? Some very innovative people out there are even tracking the route from the one postal code to the other and incorporating that into pricing models. So I think it's a very interesting question. Probably more difficult if you're thinking in the South African context is, can you get mortality data at a detailed enough level that you could perform that modeling? And my answer is not in South Africa. You wouldn't be able to do that yet. From publicly available data, potentially company level data, you could. But again, I don't think we've got the air pollution metrics. So I think that sort of project would be super interesting to do, but maybe in one of the European countries where you've got better data, both at a mortality and atmospheric perspective.
And Ronald, for that very interesting and topical presentation. So just another reminder to all of you guys, as you go into the exhibition hall, you'll find the mosaic wall. Please, we really do need all of you to take a picture, a selfie there, so that we can have a visual reminder of this year's historic convention. Next, before we break, we will have the Liberty Mindfulness session. If you'd like to take a pause before your coffee, then just stick around in this room. It'll start momentarily. Be sure to catch the final of the inaugural Insights ASA Convention Chess Championship during this break, and then don't forget to pick up your wristband if you're attending the cocktails and dinner tonight. You can get it at the garderobe on level 0 in the registration area. After the break at 9:30, we'll have the plenary, presidential plenary with a presentation of the research prizes, the President's address, a town hall style discussion with past and present society presidents, and then as well as the CEO of ASA.
Welcome to this counted breathwork technique. My name is Andrew Arnott, and I'll be guiding you through today's practice. Breathwork is a term used to describe techniques and practices to control one's breath for physical, mental, and emotional benefits. Some of the most well-known benefits of breathwork are stress reduction and anxiety management, as it helps deepen our breathing cycle and calms our nervous system. It also helps sharpen our focus and concentration, enhances our emotional regulation, increases our vitality, and improves our sleep. This process is an excellent opener for any other meditation practice. It is called 44 breaths and consists of 7 long, deep breaths, like so. 14 medium breaths, and 21 fast breaths. Then we have the transitional breaths, which is a holding in breath for about 30 seconds. Where we fill our lungs with air, and then a holding out breath, where we empty our lungs of air for about 15 seconds. This is one cycle. There's no need to remember any of this, as I will guide you through the process and can count the breaths for you. You can take a moment to get comfortable in your seat. Try to have a straight back, your shoulders soften and relaxed, your feet on the ground, and your hands on your legs or in your lap. If at any point it feels too much or overwhelming, simply let go of the breathing technique. We will begin with the first of 3 cycles, starting with 7 deep breaths. Fourteen medium breaths. Twenty-one fast breaths. Breathing in deeply to fill your lungs. And now holding that breath in, allowing the breath to help you expand. Allowing the breath to invigorate you. Allowing the breath to open you up. And exhaling. Now, take a nourishing breath in and then exhale completely to empty your lungs. And hold that breath out. This is the space of letting go. This is the space of release. And inhaling. We'll start our second round with 7 deep connected breaths.